Alright guys, what is up? Today I'm going to be comparing Colombia with Vietnam. We're going to talk about a bunch of different categories to help you decide which one is best for you. I'm currently in the Philippines, so I'm going to be making a Colombia versus Philippines video in the future. If you guys want to see my Colombia versus Thailand video, I highly recommend watching that one as well. Hey you. Yeah, you. Come here. Are you looking to move to Colombia? There's not a ton of good information out there about moving to Colombia that isn't centered around women and Medellín. That is where my course comes in. I'll teach you how to move to any city in Colombia, how the culture in each area works, what it's like dating in Colombia, how to find friends, community, an apartment, and much, much more. If you guys are interested in the course, I'm gonna leave the information down below in the pinned comment. It is the best value for a course that you will find on the market. First lesson is available for free if you guys want to try it out. So funny enough, I actually think Colombia is a lot closer to Vietnam than it is to Thailand. Thailand seems to be its own beast. It's a lot more developed and a lot more open to tourists, whereas Colombia I feel like is still opening up to tourists very similarly to Vietnam. When I was in Da Nang, I was driving around on a motorbike and there were so many neighborhoods that looked just like neighborhoods in Medellín, only they were in Southeast Asia. So let's start with food. Surprisingly enough, I actually think food is a little more diverse in Colombia than it is in Vietnam. In Vietnam, you're gonna see a lot of rice dishes, a lot of noodle dishes, pretty typical Asian food, a lot of seafood. You know, it's not a ton of meat, but it's a lot of vegetables and carbs, but they're filling and they're really good. The portion sizes are very small, and I found myself eating 4 to 5 times a day just whenever I was hungry. But because Vietnamese food is naturally very light, I always felt really good afterwards. I think I have a bias as well because Vietnamese food is kind of similar to Chinese food, and being an Asian, obviously that's my preference. But Colombia is a lot more than just the paisa food you find in Medellín. They have a lot of really good food from the coast, which is fantastic. You can go to the coffee region where it's a little more meat-based. You can go to Bogota, which is a little more bread-based. The soups are always really good. I love a lot of the menu of the day stuff, like the ma and pa restaurants in Colombia were very delicious as well. So a lot of people complain that food in Colombia doesn't have a lot of flavor and it's simple. And I can actually see the same argument being made about Vietnamese food. But just pho, the noodles and the soup and the meat and everything how it comes is so delicious. But I'm a really big fan of Colombian soups. So I think when it comes to the food, it can go either way depending on what your taste is. I think I would give the slight edge to Vietnamese food just because I'm Asian and I prefer Asian food. But if you really know Colombian food, I can see some people also giving the edge to Colombia. If you guys are interested in contacting me for a consultation or anything else, feel free to hit me up here. Okay, let's talk about things to do. Vietnam is quite diverse actually. A lot of people recommend starting in the south and pretty much just riding the coast up and doing all the cities. So you can start in Saigon and you can go up to Dalat, you can go to Hoi An, Da Nang, Nha Trang, you can go up to Hanoi, Ha Long Bay, you can do the Ha Giang Loop. There's so many things that you can do in Vietnam and they're all really awesome. Compared to Colombia, which is the second most diverse country in the world. So you can have desert, you can have beach, you can have the Amazon. You have so many things in Colombia that you can see as well. I think it really depends on your taste and what you're looking for because they're both equally nice in their own way. So I would actually give things to do a tie. For me, I liked the Vietnamese lifestyle a lot because being an Asian person. When I was in Da Nang, all I did was I would wake up whenever, I would go eat some pho or some food on the street, do some work, maybe go to a computer cafe, play some video games, then go to the beach in the afternoon. It was like the perfect city size, it was clean, it was so open. When I first arrived to Manizales, that became one of my favorite cities in the world. And to this day, I think Manizales is still my favorite mountain city, despite of everything that happened to me. And I got the same feeling when I was in Da Nang in Vietnam. Da Nang is my favorite beach city that I've ever been to in my life. Although they're different geographically, I got a lot of very similar feelings and vibes when I was there. You know, the cleanliness, the lack of pollution, not a ton of people, being able to get to know your neighbors, really kind people. Pool clubs are also very common in Vietnam, and coffee is huge in Vietnam too. Whereas in Colombia, you know, coffee is big as well, but in the coffee region is where it's really the most. Okay, so let's talk about nightlife. A lot of nightlife in Colombia revolves around getting drunk, going out, partying, dancing, like really being rowdy in that whole environment. Whereas in Vietnam, it's a lot more diverse. There are a lot of clubs and bars, especially in the big cities in Vietnam, But that's not really my scene. I love Vietnam because there's just a lot of things to do at night. There's a lot of computer cafes where I love to play video games. They're open 24/7. There's a lot of restaurants that are open until 1, 2 in the morning where you can get great Vietnamese food. Whereas in Colombia, the food that's available at those hours are just like junky food that you can find on the street. I mean, it's still good, but you know, it's nice being able to get a whole meal at 1 in the morning in so many places in Vietnam. And because Vietnam is a lot more safe, it's a lot nicer walking around at night because you don't think anything's gonna happen to you. Unfortunately, in a lot of Colombian cities, even Manizales, which is one of the safest ones, you still feel a lot of pause walking in the street at night, so it's best to try to avoid that. So you can't really enjoy nightlife as much. If you love to dance, Colombia is such a great time. So I actually find it quite hard to pick because I think the answer can depend based on what you're interested in. Even for me, I give it a tie because I had so many really good times in Colombia. If I knew more locals in Vietnam, I feel like I would have had a really good time there as well. So let's talk about the women. Interesting enough, I actually think this is a tie. When I went to Vietnam, the women have faces of Chinese people, beautiful Asian faces, with the curves and the body of Latin people. So that's why I feel like Colombia and Vietnam are pretty similar in this regard. And because Vietnam is still very local, not a lot of people speak English. They don't look too well on like white foreigners dating their women. So, you know, it's still like pretty untouched. Whereas a place like Colombia, because the secret is getting out now, a lot of foreigners and gringos are coming and kind of ruining the culture. But when it comes to just pure looks, I actually think that the faces are very beautiful in both countries, but it depends on your taste. I actually think the Philippines is a good balance between the two because especially here in Cebu, a lot of the women here in the Philippines are just as beautiful as the women in Colombia with just slightly thinner bodies because in Colombia curves are a little more, I guess, appreciated. It's harder to date in Vietnam because the language barrier is so high. But whereas in Colombia, I still think it's a little easier because, you know, Spanish and English are a lot closer together. And if you like that Latin look, where you have women of all shapes and sizes and colors, Colombia is the way to go. I think Colombian women in the world are a 10, and I think Vietnamese women, if you like Asian women, are a 10. I wish I spent more time in Vietnam so I could date the women because when I was in Da Nang, there were a few girls here and there, but because the language barrier is so high, it was a bit hard to date. And then I went to Saigon and I met a Vietnamese girl there. Just the timing of everything didn't work out, so I didn't get to go out with her. Whereas I spent like 3.5 years in Colombia, so I have vast experience in Colombia and traveling the whole entire country from north to south pretty much. So something that Vietnam and Colombia shares is their love for coffee. And my personal preference is actually Colombian coffee. The problem with Vietnam and a lot of countries where I've tried coffee around the world is that it's too strong. Whereas in Colombia, the coffee portions are a lot smaller and there's a higher focus on flavor. An advantage that Vietnam has is that they also offer tea. As a Chinese guy, I don't really drink a lot of coffee. I would much rather drink tea. And that's very difficult to find in Colombia because it's a very coffee-based society. Whereas in Vietnam, they had the best of both worlds. Plus, they had a bunch of boba shops everywhere. Colombia has better coffee, but for this whole scene in general, I think Vietnam is better. Okay, so let's talk about culture. Vietnamese culture is very interesting because there are a lot of similarities to Chinese culture in a lot of ways because China ruled over them. They were taken over by the French and then the Americans came in. Correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not that good with history. I actually found Colombian culture and Vietnamese culture to be a lot more similar than you think. They have the family culture that is very similar to the family culture that I saw in Colombia, which I really loved. In East Asian cultures, it's not that strong, but in a place like Thailand, Vietnam, and here in the Philippines, family culture is very, very strong. Vietnamese people are not super friendly until you get to know them, and then they are a lot nicer to you. Whereas in Colombia, people are a lot more friendly, unless you're in a place like Bogota, where everybody is pretty much like standoffish. But I would say Colombia in general, in most places that you go, are very friendly, open, welcoming people. I would say Vietnam and Colombia in general are still very conservative. Vietnam is not really religious like Colombia is. Colombia is a Catholic country, whereas Vietnam has some Christianity in there, but it's mostly Buddhist. But I feel like their views, especially on, for example, the LGBT movement, is still very similar. Saigon is probably the most liberal out of all the Vietnamese cities. You go to most of Vietnam, the women there are still very, very conservative. And I think Colombia, because it's so heavily influenced by the US, is more liberal in the big cities like Bogota and Medellín. But when you go to the smaller cities, like when I was in the coffee region, you're gonna notice that those traditional values are still there. Cheating is actually really big in both of these cultures. It's a big problem in Vietnam, probably worse in Colombia. Also, Vietnam is a socialist country, whereas Colombia is a more capitalistic society. Even with Petro, a leftist, as president, Colombia for the most part has stayed pretty conservative and pretty, I guess, like the US equivalent of Republican for many, many years. Let's talk about the type of tourists that you'll see. There's a very big difference in the demographic that you'll find. Vietnam gets a lot more of the backpacker type. In a place like Da Nang, there were a lot of Russian people and Korean people, Indian people too. It seems like a very popular tourist destination for those countries. You're gonna see backpackers there too, but it's mostly a lot of Westerners from the US and some from Europe coming to have like a party weekend in Medellín or Cartagena or something like that. Because not a lot of people know about Vietnam yet, most of the people looking for sexual tourism in Southeast Asia, I imagine, go to places like Thailand is probably number one, and then the Philippines. Whereas in all of Latin America, I think the sexual tourism scene right now is pretty much concentrated in Colombia, specifically Medellín and Cartagena. I would say that in a place like Saigon, there are a lot of Asian tourists, Japanese, Korean, Chinese, who do go there looking for sexual tourism, but I don't think it's quite to the same level or promoted quite as heavily as a place like Medellín, where all the content that you see about Medellín, 80% of it revolves around the women. You have some good creators like Life with David, AK Joel, who are really trying to provide value. Let's be real, right? Most people go to Colombia for the women. And based off of my experience meeting people, all the consultations that I've done, that seems to be true. Okay, so let's talk about safety. Colombia is way less safe, and it's not even a competition. Vietnam, in a place like Saigon, has some places that are a bit sketchy, but you never have to worry about violent crime. The worst that you really have to worry about is just like snatchers, people stealing your purse. Whereas in Colombia, you have to worry about so many things. You have to worry about kidnapping, you have to worry about getting drugged, you have to worry about armed robbery, and the people, if they rob you on the street, will not hesitate to kill you. There's something weird about that narco culture from Pablo Escobar that has still persisted through time, even though he's long gone. Medellín and Cali are like the hubs for crime. Like on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being super dangerous, Saigon is probably like a 5. Cali is like a 9, maybe like a 10. Medellín right now is getting to like an 8. Bogota is like an 8 or 9 as well, so it's not even a competition. So we can talk about style and fashion. I love Vietnamese style because it's very close to my personal style. It's very clean cut. A lot of really nice clothes are made in Vietnam. If you think about like all these famous brands, a lot of them outsource their work to Vietnam. They have the more business casual kind of look, and they're all really well fitted, perfect for people like me who are on the shorter side and with my build as an Asian. People in Colombia dress very, very nicely and a lot more diverse. In a place like Vietnam, you're gonna see a lot of the people walking around with the conservative Asian dress, and I absolutely love it because the Vietnamese women look fire in that dress. But if you go to Colombia, you're gonna see Paisa women have a uniform. People in Bogota dress a lot more professional, but then you go to the coast and the costeñas, they love to wear dresses, a lot more flowy. Femininity in Colombian women is still unmatched. I find that Colombia is a lot more diverse when it comes to style and culture compared to Vietnam. The women in both countries care about appearance a lot. I noticed that in Vietnam, the women are very vain. You're gonna notice them taking pictures all the time, but I also saw that in Colombia. It's the kind of countries where a lot of women will not leave the house looking like a mess. They always wanna look good. But in Vietnam, because it's Southeast Asia, you're gonna see a lot of women walking around with just like shorts and a t-shirt, not really caring. But when the women dress up, they really, really dress up. There's not too much to buy in Colombia that you can't really buy in Asia because everything's made here in Asia anyways. I love the shopping scene in Vietnam, and Thailand, it's really good as well. Here in the Philippines, the quality isn't as good as like Vietnam. Vietnam, to me, was like the mecca for buying clothes. I actually think at this moment, Vietnam is a bit cheaper than Colombia. Colombia's prices are on the rise, especially with the fluctuation of the dollar and the peso. Like the best time in Colombia was like a year or two ago when the dollar was at 5,000 right before the year changed and inflation hit. But now the dollar has gone back down to 4,000, but inflation has maintained the same. Prices, especially rent in places like Medellín, have shot up like crazy. Whereas Vietnam is a little more stable, prices are still really cheap. In the bigger cities are more expensive compared to a place like Da Nang, but I still find that in general, you're probably gonna be spending less money in Vietnam. Plus, the food is a lot better. In Vietnam, they have steak restaurants, but I'm like, why would I spend $15 or $20 for a steak when I can spend $10 for unlimited Korean barbecue, right? That's like the big difference between Colombia and Vietnam. When it comes to English and being open to tourists. Both of these countries still need a lot of work. Colombia is definitely getting a lot better in that because they have a heavy US influence, so a lot of people there are learning English. But in Vietnam, English is still quite lacking. And because there are a lot of Asian tourists, surprisingly in Vietnam, I heard a lot of people speaking Korean or Chinese, right? Like, so they can cater to that foreign demographic. The infrastructure for tourism. I think Vietnam is getting slightly better in this, and their infrastructure is better than Colombia's in a lot of ways. Colombia has just exploded these last few years, so I think Colombia is slowly catching up. When it comes to the digital nomad and expat scene, you have to give the winner to Colombia. Medellín has exploded as being one of the biggest digital nomad hubs in the world. Vietnam is just not quite there yet. I saw a lot of foreigners in Saigon, and I saw quite a bit in Da Nang, but they weren't really from the West, they were from Russia or Korea. Vietnam is not really talked about at the moment for a digital nomad hub compared to a place like Portugal, Mexico, or Colombia. So infrastructure in Colombia is surprisingly good, but there's a lot of corruption with a lot of the roads. So projects that should have taken 2 or 3 years maximum had taken 10 years. I was just very surprised at the infrastructure in Vietnam in a city like Da Nang. But in a place like Saigon, it was very unimpressive, almost actually like really, really bad. And traffic in Vietnam is horrendous. It is notorious for being like absolute chaos, especially with public transportation. I actually think Colombia wins. Colombia's infrastructure is surprisingly good. And even in the small city like Manizales, I was able to take the bus everywhere, and it was a pretty well-designed city. Medellín has their metro, which is really nice. Bogota is just really big, so public transportation isn't really good there. Another thing to keep in mind as well is the difference in time zone. Vietnam has a favorable time zone for digital nomads that are working out of Asia. Colombia is just so convenient because it has the same time zone as the US. And because it's located right in the middle of the US and South America, Colombia is just such an ideal location to set up. Trying to hang out with my friends and do some business and do consultations, I have to plan it at like the weirdest hours because just the time zones are all messed up. Colombia is an amazing country. In spite of everything that happened to me, I still look back at it very fondly. It's very diverse. It has some of the most beautiful women in the world, depending on your taste. It has great friendly people. Food there is very high quality, even though it may not be the best tasting, it's the best quality in terms of nutrients. It's a lot more westernized compared to Asia. Time zone is very favorable if you come from the West. It's easy to buy real estate as well, because as a foreigner, you can buy real estate in Colombia, whereas Vietnam, the laws are a lot stricter for that. The dance culture in Colombia is amazing. There's a really amazing nightlife scene if you're into partying. And surprisingly, the homes in Colombia are very organized and they're very proper. They care about their appearances and how they present a lot, and they're very well-mannered people, all things considered. Plus, I think it's a lot easier to make friends in Colombia. But some of the downsides: the bureaucracy, safety is a huge issue. You can get drugged, there's armed robbery problems, there's so many issues when it comes to safety in Colombia. Culture shock for a lot of people. I know that was a big thing for me, especially getting married to a Colombian. You're gonna find that a lot of people there are very closed-minded. The language barrier is an issue for people not wanting to learn Spanish. Food is pretty mediocre in parts of the country, but if you cook yourself, you're gonna find that the produce there is still really good. But there's not a lot of really good international options if you're in the smaller cities. You're gonna meet a lot of untrustworthy people. They may be nice to you up front, but it's hard to trust their intentions, unfortunately. And the rising rent prices in a city like Medellín or Cartagena. When it comes to Vietnam, you have really great food, lots of noodles, less condiments and spices, but a lot of vegetables, so it's really easy to eat healthy in Vietnam. A great nightlife scene if you're not really into partying, but if you're a night owl, Asia in general is really awesome for you. You get a really local, authentic experience compared to a very tourist experience in a place like Thailand. It's easy to get a moto for transportation. As long as you have an ID, they'll give you a moto, no problem. They have a really nice coffee and tea scene, and the fashion and shopping here is really awesome. Some of the cons though, and especially in the bigger cities, they are very dirty. It is very unorganized. Traffic is terrible in the big cities of Vietnam, and air pollution is really, really bad as well. You see air pollution in Colombia in the big cities like Medellín, Bogota, but in most of the country, it's still pretty well maintained. And Medellín is surprisingly environmentally friendly. Vietnam isn't really open to foreigners at the moment. They have really dirty bathrooms. In Colombia, they're surprisingly very clean. And in Vietnam, it's not quite on that level yet. And it's hard to buy real estate as a foreigner as well. Which country is for you? If you guys want more information, feel free to contact me here for a consultation. I'll leave all the details for the course down below in the description and the pinned comment so you guys can check that out. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.